It was another busy afternoon at the city's main square. People were rushing past, each with their own thoughts, their own destinations, and their own problems. Some were running to catch buses, some were carrying heavy grocery bags, and others were just trying to enjoy a few minutes in the sun before heading back to work. In the middle of all this, near the corner of the square, there was an old piano sitting on a small platform. Its paint was chipped, the wood scratched, and it looked as if it had been there for years, waiting for someone who cared enough to play it. At first, nobody really paid attention. Street performers came and went every day. Some were good, some were loud, and some just made noise. Most people had learned to ignore them. Their minds were elsewhere, focused on messages on their phones or lists in their heads. But today, something different was about to happen. A child approached the piano. He was small, maybe no older than 10. His clothes were simple, slightly worn, but clean. He didn't have the confidence of a performer used to an audience. He didn't even seem to expect anyone to notice him. He simply walked over, sat on the little wooden stool, and placed his small hands on the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. The child just looked at the piano as if he were trying to remember a secret he had once known. People walking by barely glanced at him. Some even smiled, shaking their heads. "Poor kid," one passerby whispered. "Doesn't even know how to play." Another laughed softly. "He's just a child. This will be over in a minute." The child didn't seem to hear any of this. He took a deep breath and slowly pressed one key. A soft, slightly awkward note came out. Then another. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't fast, but there was something in the way he pressed the keys, something gentle, careful, as if he were speaking to the piano rather than just playing it. A few people stopped for a second, curious. Children, especially, tend to look at other children with interest. One small boy, holding his mother's hand, tilted his head and watched closely. The mother gave a slight shrug as if saying, "It's just a child playing." But still, they didn't move away. The child's fingers moved slowly, almost hesitantly, across the keys. It was clear he wasn't there to show off or make money. There were no dramatic gestures, no loud calls for attention. Everything about him screamed quiet focus. And somehow, even in that small, unconfident way, people started noticing. A woman sitting on a nearby bench put down her shopping bag. She watched the child's hands carefully move over the keys. At first, she thought he was just experimenting. But then she realized he was playing a melody, not just random notes. It wasn't complicated, but there was a rhythm, a flow, and most importantly, a feeling behind it. A man in a business suit who had been rushing past slowed down. He frowned, confused. He had passed this piano countless times, and he had never seen anyone play anything worth noticing. But now, this small child was creating a sound that seemed to make the busy square pause for a moment. Even the traffic noise felt softer somehow, as if the city itself had decided to listen. The child's eyes were focused, almost closed as he followed a melody only he could hear. The sun reflected off his hair, and there was a small crease of concentration between his eyebrows. His lips moved slightly, not making sound, but forming words only he could understand. To anyone else, he was just a kid trying to play an old piano. But to those who stopped, there was something else, something rare and delicate. A group of teenagers passed by, laughing and joking. They'd barely noticed him at first, thinking it was a silly moment. But then one of them paused. "Wait, is he actually playing?" The boy whispered. His friends stopped too, their laughter dying down. One by one they turned to watch, realizing that this small child was creating something unexpected. Even the street vendor across the square, who had spent years shouting over the noise, leaned against his cart. He didn't know the boy, and he didn't know why, but he felt like he had to listen. The music was soft, almost fragile, but it carried a weight that made the world feel a little smaller, a little kinder. For just a few seconds, not everyone noticed, of course. Some people kept walking, distracted by their phones, their meetings, their errands. Some laughed quietly at the thought of a small child thinking he could compete with the sounds of the city. But more and more, people began to stop. Eyes turned. Conversations paused. Phones were raised, not to make fun, but to capture the moment. The child didn't seem to care about the audience. He wasn't playing for praise or money. He was playing because he had to. Because there was something inside him that needed to come out, something that only the piano could express. And that authenticity, that honesty, was what began to draw people in. A small elderly man sitting nearby, who had been watching quietly for a while, nodded to himself. He had seen many performers over the years, but there was a difference here. This child wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't performing tricks or playing fast scales. He was simply telling a story. And even without words, that story reached into the hearts of those willing to listen. The square, usually a place of movement and noise, had changed. For the first time that afternoon, the busy city seemed to breathe a little slower. The people who stopped were no longer just passing strangers, they were witnesses. They were part of something fragile, something fleeting, but unforgettable. The child continued to play, his small fingers moving across the keys with growing confidence. Each note built on the last, forming a simple, beautiful melody that was impossible to ignore. Even the most skeptical observers felt their curiosity turn into quiet admiration. They had come to think of him as just a child, but something inside them was beginning to shift. Maybe he wasn't just a child. Maybe there was more here than anyone could have guessed. As the final notes of the first short piece lingered in the air, the child's hands hovered over the keys for a moment. He looked up, realizing some people were actually watching him. There were no claps yet, no cheers, just a few pairs of wide eyes and soft smiles. But it was enough to make him smile, back a small, shy smile that hid years of practice and determination behind it. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered to their companions. "Did you hear that?" One person said softly, "He's just a kid, but he plays like that?" And in that moment, something magical had begun. The idea that this child might be ordinary had been shattered, replaced with the quiet understanding that he had something extraordinary to share. The first part of this story wasn't about fame, applause, or recognition. It was about the moment when the world began to notice, even slightly, that greatness could come from unexpected places. It was about the first step in a journey that would change the way people thought, not just about this child, but about the possibilities hidden in anyone who dares to express themselves. And so, in the middle of a busy city square, surrounded by people who didn't expect much, a small child at an old piano had already begun to change everything. His music, simple and honest, had planted a seed in the hearts of those who were paying attention. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning. The air in the square seemed to change as the child continued to play. At first, people had stopped out of curiosity, wondering what a small boy could do on an old piano. But now, as the notes flowed, something deeper began to happen. The music was soft but deliberate, simple but full of emotion. It felt as though each note carried a story, a small secret meant for anyone who would take the time to listen. The child's fingers moved more confidently now. He had started slowly, testing the keys, letting the sound find its way into him. But now, with the first few notes settling, his hand seemed to almost glide over the keys. The melody grew richer, filling the space around him. It wasn't fast or flashy, but it had a power that no one expected. People in the crowd felt it. They felt it in their chest, in their stomach. In the quiet spaces between their thoughts, a woman sitting on a bench nearby leaned forward. She wasn't a musician, but she had always loved music. She had attended concerts, played songs on her old piano at home, and even sang softly when she thought no one was listening. But this was different. She could feel the child's emotion in every note. It was as if he were speaking without words, telling a story that only music could carry. Her hands rested on her knees, tense, as if she needed to steady herself just to take it all in. Across the square, a man with a briefcase stopped walking. He had been on his way to a meeting, thinking about reports and deadlines, but now he found himself standing still, his brow furrowed as he listened. He had no idea what piece the child was playing or if it even had a name. It didn't matter. The sound was enough. It made him pause and remember something he had forgotten, the feeling of wonder, the sense of being present in a moment without thinking about what came next. The crowd began to grow. Some people had come back after passing by earlier, curious to see if the child could really play. Others had heard the music from a distance and followed it, drawn by a sense they couldn't explain. A few were hesitant at first, standing at the edge, unsure if this was worth their attention. But the sound reached them, breaking through the barrier of doubt. Slowly they edged closer. Children, especially, were captivated. They didn't need to understand every note or the theory behind it. They simply felt it. A little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly. Her eyes were wide, shining with admiration. The mother smiled, letting her child watch. There was no rush, no expectation, just a shared moment of amazement. The child on the piano didn't notice the growing audience. He wasn't playing for applause or for recognition or even for anyone to see him. He was lost in the music, his mind focused entirely on the melody he had in his heart. It was as if the piano was speaking to him, and he was simply helping it share its voice. One older man, who had seen countless street performers over the years, felt a lump in his throat. He had witnessed many people trying to perform, many failing, and many more simply going unnoticed. But this was something rare. The music carried a kind of honesty he hadn't heard in years. It reminded him of times long ago, of moments when life seemed simpler, of feelings that had been buried under years of routine. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. Even the busiest people in the square began to slow down. A cyclist paused, propping his bike against a lamppost. A mother with a stroller stopped mid-step. A young man on a phone stopped talking and listened. The child's performance was no longer background noise. It had become the center of the square, the heartbeat of the moment. People who had planned to rush past found themselves standing there, unable to move, unable to look away. The melody shifted. It grew softer for a few beats, almost hesitant, like the child was unsure where to take it next. Then it rose again, more confident this time, more deliberate. It was a pattern of tension and release, of quiet thought and sudden expression. The child's body swayed slightly with the music, his face serene but intense. He wasn't aware of the impact he was having. He simply continued to play, letting the piano guide him. A couple standing nearby whispered to each other. "Can you believe it? He's just a kid," the woman said, her voice full of disbelief. The man nodded, unable to take his eyes off the performance. "I know," he replied softly. "It's like, he's not just playing, he's telling a story. And it's beautiful." The crowd grew even larger as more people noticed. Some had phones out, recording snippets of the performance, but most simply stood listening. There was a silence between the notes, a pause in the rush of the day that made the experience feel almost sacred. Even those who didn't normally appreciate music found themselves caught in the spell. The child's hands moved with surprising skill. Each note, though soft, was precise. Each chord, though simple, was emotionally charged. The music was full of life, full of hope, full of longing. People couldn't help but feel something inside them shift. Old memories surfaced. Hopes they had forgotten were rekindled. A quiet joy, the kind that doesn't need words, spread among the listeners. A young man with headphones around his neck removed them, drawn by the sound. He had been focused on his music app, listening to something he knew would make him feel powerful, energetic, unstoppable. But now, standing in that square, listening to a child play, he realized that nothing he had heard before could compare. This wasn't just music. This was emotion, raw and unfiltered, shared in the simplest of ways. The child paused briefly, catching his breath. The crowd waited, though nobody moved to speak or applaud. They didn't want to interrupt, didn't want to break the moment. The pause felt intentional, a small, quiet space to let the music breathe. And then, without warning, he continued, his fingers dancing across the keys with renewed confidence. The melody changed slightly, becoming more complex. It was still soft, still gentle, but now it carried a weight of experience, of feelings that seemed far older than his years. People leaned in, sensing the depth behind each note. It wasn't just skill, it was understanding. The child seemed to know the emotions of everyone around him, and he poured them into the music. A middle-aged woman in a hat, who had been skeptical at first, felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but it was no use. The child's performance had reached her heart in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because she was moved, because she had been reminded that beauty could exist anywhere. Even in the middle of a busy square, even from someone so small, so young, people began to whisper to one another, sharing their amazement. "He's incredible," one person said. "How can someone so young play like that?" Another replied, "It's not just that he can play. It's the feeling behind it. You can tell he means it." These words spread quietly through the crowd, building a sense of shared wonder. The child's eyes were closed now, his focus complete. He was no longer aware of the people, the square, or the noise of the city. Only the music mattered. Only the piano mattered. Only the story he was telling mattered. And in that moment, the world seemed to stop, if only for a few minutes. To listen to a small child who had something extraordinary to say, the melody reached a gentle climax. The notes hung in the air, soft and lingering, like a memory that refuses to fade. The child's fingers finally came to rest on the keys, and he opened his eyes. For a moment, the crowd didn't move. They didn't clap, didn't cheer, didn't speak. They simply sat in stunned silence, absorbing the final impression of what they had just witnessed. Thought it was impossible to describe in words what had just happened. Some people were smiling, some were quiet, some were wiping away tears. But everyone who had stopped to listen felt the same thing. They had been part of something rare, something magical, something unforgettable. The child, still seated at the piano, looked around. He seemed surprised by the attention, almost shy. He had not expected anyone to stay. He had not expected anyone to notice him at all. And yet, here they were, an audience of strangers, silently acknowledging that he had done something remarkable. And in that moment, the first part of the transformation had occurred. The child was no longer invisible. The world had begun to take notice. But even as people whispered and smiled, applauded quietly, or simply stood in awe, nobody yet knew that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The music had opened a door to possibilities, to recognition, to a journey that could change not just the child's life, but the lives of everyone who had been touched by his performance. And as he took a small, deep breath and prepared to continue, it was clear that what had started as a quiet curiosity was about to grow into something unforgettable. The square had changed completely since the child had started playing. People who had been rushing past, busy with their own lives, now lingered. They stood in small clusters, quietly listening, unsure if they should applaud or simply stay still. The child had captured their attention in a way that was almost magical. Even the usual noise of the city, the honking cars, the chatter of strangers, the distant construction sounds seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the piano's soft, emotional melody. Some of the younger children in the crowd had moved closer. They were fascinated, their eyes wide, mouths slightly open. One little boy, holding his father's hand, pointed at the child on the piano. "Look, Dad, he's playing like a grown-up," he said in amazement. The father smiled, letting the boy tug at his hand as they both watched. For once, the city didn't feel rushed or busy. For once, it felt full of wonder. The child's fingers moved faster now, but not in a showy way. Every note had a purpose. Every chord carried feeling. There was a rhythm to his playing that made the heart beat a little faster, that made people lean forward without realizing it. Even strangers who were tired or upset seemed to feel lighter. The music carried them away from their worries for a few precious minutes, reminding them that beauty could be found in the smallest places. A young woman, who had been sitting on a bench scrolling through her phone, had been completely drawn in. She had not even noticed she had stopped moving her fingers over the screen. Her eyes were fixed on the child, and she could feel herself holding her breath with every note. She didn't know what it was about him, how such small hands could create such powerful sound, but she couldn't look away. The music was like a magnet, pulling her and everyone else closer. Even those who were skeptical at first were changing. A man who had walked past shaking his head earlier now stood leaning against a lamppost, his eyes wide. He had thought, just a child? Nothing special. But the melody had proven him wrong. It wasn't just the skill, it was the feeling behind it. There was something alive in the music, a kind of emotion that no one could ignore. He watched the child's hands moving swiftly but carefully, and felt a strange sense of awe. The crowd had grown considerably. People who had come from nearby streets, drawn by the music, now formed a semicircle around the piano. Some whispered to each other, trying to explain what they were feeling. "It's incredible," one said. "It's like he's telling a story with each note." Another replied quietly, "I don't know how, but I feel it too." "It's beautiful." The child's expression remained calm, almost serene. He didn't smile or look around for approval. He was focused entirely on the music. His eyes occasionally flicked down to the keys, but mostly he seemed lost in thought, following the melody only he could hear. There was no performance in his actions. There was only expression, pure and honest. And that honesty was what made everyone feel so connected. A few people in the crowd had begun recording the performance on their phones. But even as they captured the moment, they couldn't help but look up again and again. The music was something that could not be fully captured on a screen. It had to be felt, experienced in person. The notes filled the air with a kind of warmth that made the square feel different, alive. In a way that people hadn't noticed before, the melody changed subtly. It became softer, gentler, almost like a whisper. But in that softness, there was power. The child's playing could make people stop thinking about their busy lives, their schedules, their problems. It made them feel something bigger, something that had nothing to do with money or success. It reminded them of simple joys, of quiet mornings, of laughter, of the comfort of music. Even strangers who had never listened to piano before felt drawn in. A construction worker, taking a short break, leaned on his shovel and closed his eyes. He didn't know the child's name, didn't know the piece, didn't care. He just listened, letting the music wash over him. Each note seemed to carry a message he couldn't put into words, a feeling that made him stop thinking and start feeling. The child's performance was no longer just entertainment. It had become something bigger, a shared experience. People were connected in silence, their attention held by the melody that seemed to float effortlessly in the air. Some were smiling softly. Some had tears in their eyes. Some were simply quiet, their hearts full of a sense of wonder they hadn't felt in years. A young couple, who had been arguing before they stopped, now stood side by side, listening. Their quarrel had been petty, nothing worth remembering. But the music reminded them of something important, that life could be beautiful, even in the middle of ordinary, stressful days. They didn't speak, but they held hands, feeling closer than they had before. The child didn't notice the crowd growing. He didn't notice the adults who were astonished, the children who were staring in amazement, or the strangers who were silently admiring him. He only noticed the piano, the sound, the connection between his mind and the keys. And in that focus, the music became even more powerful. The melody now carried a feeling of hope. There was a gentle rise and fall like waves on a calm sea. People felt their hearts lift, even if just a little. An elderly woman in the crowd whispered softly to herself, "It's like he understands life in a way most people never do." She had tears in her eyes. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of understanding, of seeing something pure and extraordinary in someone so young. Even the city itself seemed to pause. The usual sounds, the distant bus engines, the chatter of children, the clattering of footsteps faded into the background. The music filled the space with a calm that nobody had expected to find in a busy square. People were no longer rushing. People were no longer distracted. They were simply there, present in a moment that felt bigger than themselves. The child's hands moved quickly now, but every note remained precise, deliberate, and full of emotion. The music had a rhythm that seemed almost alive, moving the crowd in ways they couldn't explain. Heads tilted, breaths were held, and eyes followed the tiny fingers that seemed to carry the weight of something much greater than the child himself. A man who had been walking his dog stopped. letting the leash slip slightly as he leaned forward. His dog barked at first, but then quieted, sensing the unusual atmosphere. He had walked past that piano many times, but had never stopped. Today, he realized, was different. This small child was capable of something rare, something that touched the hearts of everyone who took a moment to pay attention. Some teenagers who had initially laughed and joked now whispered among themselves. "I didn't expect this," one said. "He's incredible." Another nodded, unable to speak for a moment, feeling a strange admiration for someone so young. They were learning without even realizing it. That talent isn't measured by age or appearance. It's measured by heart. The child's playing reached another quiet pause, a moment where the melody seemed to hang in the air like a soft cloud. The crowd exhaled almost collectively, feeling the weight of the music even in the silence. And then he continued, gently, softly. As if telling a story that was too important to rush, people began to notice small details they had missed at first, the way his fingers hovered over the keys, the way he tilted his head slightly as he listened to the sound he was creating, the way he seemed completely at peace. There was no fear, no need to prove anything, just the music and him and the connection it was making with the people around him. An older man, who had been watching quietly from the side, whispered to his companion. "It's rare to see someone this young who plays not just with skill, but with understanding. He feels the music. He lives it." His companion nodded, eyes fixed on the child, feeling the truth in the words. The music continued, flowing like a gentle river through the square. Each note brought a small shift in the atmosphere. People began to smile at strangers. People who had been angry, impatient, or distracted felt their hearts lighten. Some clasped their hands together, holding the sensation close. Others closed their eyes, letting the music take them away from the busy, noisy world for just a few minutes. And all the while, the child played on, unaware of the effect he was having. He wasn't performing for fame or attention. He wasn't thinking about the crowd, about phones recording, about strangers staring. He was simply expressing himself, letting the piano become a bridge between him and anyone willing to listen. By now, the square was almost entirely quiet. People had stopped their conversations, their phones, their hurried steps. All that existed was the music and the small child playing it. It was as if the city itself had taken a breath, holding it, listening, waiting. The melody started to build again, slowly, carefully, like a gentle wave growing in the ocean. The emotion in each note was clear hope, longing, joy, and a little bit of sadness, all blended together in a way that only someone with a deep connection to music could convey. The crowd felt it. They leaned in, instinctively, as if trying to absorb every sound, every feeling, every heartbeat of the performance. It was no longer a simple street performance. It was an experience, a moment in time that touched everyone differently, yet made them feel united. And all of it came from one small child, sitting quietly at an old piano, doing something ordinary in the most extraordinary way possible. The square had become a different place entirely. What had started as a few curious glances had now turned into a sea of faces, all focused on the small child sitting at the old piano. People who had been rushing to their destinations were now standing still, captivated. The city's usual chaos seemed to have paused. As if the world itself had decided to take a moment to listen. The child's music had grown stronger, yet softer at times, delicate but full of emotion. Every note seemed carefully chosen, every chord a word in a story that no one could hear in normal language. It wasn't flashy or showy. There were no dramatic flourishes, no attempts to impress. Just pure, honest music, pouring directly from the child's heart into the hearts of those listening. People began leaning in closer, almost unconsciously. Some had their phones out, recording snippets, but most simply wanted to experience it fully in the moment. A young mother held her baby close, rocking him gently as she watched, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. Even her fussy baby seemed soothed, staring with wide eyes at the movement of the child's fingers on the piano keys. A group of office workers who had been arguing about a missed deadline stopped mid-conversation. They had no idea why they had come to this square in the first place, but now they stood shoulder to shoulder, listening. One of them, usually quick to roll his eyes at anything sentimental, found his hand resting on his chin, his jaw slack in disbelief. I don't know how he does it," he whispered to a colleague. "He's just a child, but it feels like he's been through a lifetime already." The child's eyes were closed as he played, his body moving slightly with the rhythm, his small head tilting as though he were listening to something only he could hear. He had no idea how many people had stopped to watch. He didn't notice the smiles, the tears, or the quiet gasps of astonishment. He didn't need to. He was lost in the music, completely absorbed in the story he was telling with each note. A woman standing near the edge of the crowd wiped her eyes. She wasn't sad, at least not in the usual sense. She was moved, touched by something she couldn't explain. She thought of times she had been rushed and tired, of days she had spent worrying about things that didn't matter, and suddenly all of it seemed lighter. The music reminded her that there was beauty in life, even in unexpected places. The melody began to build, slowly at first like the rising of the sun over a quiet field. Each note was stronger than the last, each chord carrying more emotion. The small child was no longer just playing. He was guiding the crowd through a journey. People's breaths seemed to match the rhythm of the music. They leaned in without realizing it, as though drawn by an invisible thread. Following the story unfolding under the child's fingers, even the skeptics were no longer skeptical. A man who had earlier thought the performance was a joke now stood with his arms crossed, staring at the piano in awe. His face softened. "I didn't think a child could do this," he murmured. "It's not just skill, it's feeling. He feels it." The music shifted suddenly softer now, almost a whisper. The child's hands moved lightly across the keys, delicate and precise. People instinctively leaned closer, as though afraid the sound might vanish if they didn't pay full attention. There was a quiet intensity in the air. Even the birds seemed to pause in their flight, chirping only occasionally as if they too were listening. A teenage boy at the back of the crowd whispered to his friend, "Do you feel that? Like it's speaking to us?" His friend nodded silently, eyes wide, unable to find words. The feeling was too strong, too real to be captured by ordinary conversation. The music had become a language all its own. The child's fingers moved faster now, but every note remained clear and intentional. It was as if his small hands could translate feelings into sound: joy, sorrow, hope, longing, all blended seamlessly into one flowing melody. People felt chills. Some had tears in their eyes. Some whispered softly to themselves. Some clasped their hands together, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion they had not expected from someone so young. An elderly man standing near the back of the crowd shook his head slowly. He had seen many performers in his lifetime, but none had ever moved him like this. "He's remarkable," he said quietly to a companion. "It's not just talent, it's heart. He's pouring himself into the music." His companion nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Overwhelmed by what they were witnessing, the child's music grew even more intense, reaching toward a climax. People felt their hearts race in time with the rising melody. Some leaned on benches or lampposts, unable to stand entirely still. Others held their hands over their chests as if to contain the emotion building inside them. The music was no longer just sound, it was an experience. A shared moment that made everyone present feel connected, as if they were all part of something larger than themselves. A mother with 2 children whispered softly, "He's amazing. Look at him. Just look at him." Her children nodded, completely mesmerized. They had seen street performers before, but none like this. This child was different. He wasn't performing tricks or trying to make people clap. He was speaking with his hands, with his heart, with every small motion of his body as he played. The crowd was now completely silent, save for the piano. Even the usual city noises, the cars, the chatter, the distant construction seemed to have faded away. For a few minutes, there was only the child and his music, and the people who had stopped everything just to listen. It was a rare, unspoken magic, and everyone could feel it. The melody slowed, softening as if preparing for its final moments. People held their breath. The child's hands hovered briefly over the keys, then continued with a gentle, deliberate touch. Each note was softer than the last, fading slowly, leaving a quiet resonance in the air. The audience felt the stillness, the weight of the moment, the delicate beauty of what had just happened. And then, silence. Absolute, complete silence. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody clapped. The world felt paused, suspended in awe of the small child who had created such a powerful, moving performance. People's eyes were wide. Hearts were full. Minds were quiet, taking in the impossible reality of what they had just witnessed. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the first clap came. One person, sitting on a bench, tapped their hands together softly. Then another and another. The sound grew until it was thunderous, echoing through the square. People stood, cheering, some laughing, some crying, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The child looked up, startled. His small hands trembled slightly as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The applause didn't end. People were clapping for him, for the music, for the emotion he had shared. They were clapping because something extraordinary had happened in an ordinary city square. Something beautiful, something pure, something that would not be forgotten. The child's face broke into a small, shy smile. He hadn't expected this. He had played simply because he had wanted to, because the music needed to be played. But now he saw the faces around him, the joy, the awe, the tears, and he realized he had touched something bigger than himself. A few people stepped forward, offering quiet words of praise. That was incredible," one said. "You have a gift," another added. The child simply nodded, a little embarrassed by the attention. He wasn't used to it. He had always played quietly in small moments, for himself or for a few family members. But now, hundreds of strangers were celebrating him. And slowly, a feeling of pride and happiness began to bloom inside him. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy lingered. People walked away smiling, whispering to each other, replaying the melody in their minds. Some continued talking about the small child and the piano, sharing their astonishment with anyone who would listen. They had witnessed something rare, a moment of true talent and heart that had changed their day, perhaps even their perspective forever. The child remained at the piano, taking a deep breath. He felt something he had never felt before, recognition, not just for his skill, but for his heart, his courage, and the music he had shared. It was a quiet triumph, a small victory that would remain with him long after the square had emptied and the city had returned to its usual rhythm. And in that quiet aftermath, one thing was clear: this was not the end. The performance had touched the hearts of many, and the world had begun to see what had been hidden in plain sight: a child with extraordinary talent, capable of creating beauty that no one could ignore. After the applause had died down and the crowd began to slowly disperse, a quiet settled over the square. The small child remained at the piano for a moment longer, hands still hovering above the keys as if afraid to break the spell of what had just happened. His chest rose and fell with deep, uneven breaths. The world felt different now, brighter, softer, more alive. He didn't yet understand what had changed, but he could feel it deep inside. Something had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had been there. People lingered nearby, some hesitant to leave. They wanted to catch one last glimpse of the boy who had brought so much emotion and beauty to their day. Some whispered softly to one another, sharing the astonishment that had settled over them. "He's only a child, and yet he plays like someone who has lived a lifetime," one woman said quietly. "It's not just talent," another added. "It's heart. Pure heart." A man, who had been recording on his phone, approached slowly. He didn't want to startle the child. He held out his hand, offering a simple compliment. You were incredible," he said softly. The child looked up, eyes wide and shy. He nodded, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you," unsure how to respond. Compliments had never come like this, not from strangers, not in such volume. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. From the edges of the crowd, A music teacher who had been watching in awe stepped forward. She had worked with many talented students, but she had rarely seen such raw, natural ability in someone so young. She knelt slightly to meet the child's gaze and said, "You have something very special. Have you ever considered learning more formally, playing for bigger audiences?" The child blinked, unsure how to respond. He had never imagined that anyone outside his small world would notice his music in such a serious way. A few parents of other children came forward as well, their faces full of curiosity and admiration. They asked questions softly, trying not to overwhelm him. "Where did you learn to play? Have you been practicing for a long time?" The child hesitated before answering. He explained simply that he had always loved music, that he practiced quietly whenever he could, and that playing piano made him happy. There was no boast, no sense of pride, just honesty. People began to share stories with him. Strangers talked about moments when music had helped them in difficult times, moments when they had felt lost, and how hearing the child play reminded them of hope. Some older adults spoke of memories long past, of concerts they had attended, or of loved ones they had lost. The small child listened quietly, absorbing it all. Sensing that his music had somehow created a connection stronger than words, a few local reporters had arrived by this time. Having heard about the extraordinary performance, they asked to take pictures, record a short interview, and ask a few questions about the child's inspiration. The child was shy at first, unsure what to say, but he spoke simply and sincerely, explaining that he just wanted to share the music that lived inside him. He didn't talk about fame or awards, only about the joy that playing piano brought him. The teacher who had approached earlier offered to help the child find more guidance, teachers, and opportunities to perform. She explained that talent like his could grow into something extraordinary with support and encouragement. The child nodded, still unsure what it all meant, but feeling a spark of excitement and possibility. For the first time, he could imagine a future where he could share his music with more than just a handful of people. In the following days, the square became a place of memory for those who had been there. People who had watched the child play spoke of the experience to friends and family. They described the way his music had moved them, how it had made them pause in the middle of their busy lives, and how it had reminded them that beauty could appear in unexpected places. It became a story people carried with them, a story of a small child who could create something extraordinary with nothing but his heart and an old piano. The child himself felt a quiet transformation. He had always loved music, but now he realized that what he created could touch others in a profound way. It was no longer just about practice or personal enjoyment. It was about sharing, connecting, and inspiring. He began to think differently about every note he played, every melody he imagined. Each time he sat at the piano, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. Opportunities started to appear slowly, almost naturally. Local musicians invited him to play in small recitals. Teachers offered lessons to help him develop new techniques. Some of the parents who had witnessed his performance offered encouragement and support, making sure he had the time and space to continue learning without feeling pressured. The child embraced it cautiously, still shy, still quiet, but deeply aware that his music mattered more than he had ever imagined. Even friends at school noticed a change. They saw a quiet confidence in him, a calm that hadn't been there before. People who had doubted his abilities before now looked at him with a new respect, and even classmates who had once ignored him began to listen when he spoke, curious to hear what he had to share. He had never sought attention, but he now realized that being seen could be a force for good if used in the right way. The city itself seemed to remember the day. For weeks afterward, people would return to the square, hoping to hear the child play again. Some came from across town, having heard stories from friends or on social media. They didn't come expecting a performance like those in concert halls. They came hoping for a simple, human experience. A reminder that ordinary places could hold extraordinary moments. The child's parents noticed a change in him as well. He seemed happier, more assured, though still humble and quiet. They encouraged him gently, making sure he understood that the attention was a reflection of his talent, not a reason to feel pressured. They reminded him that the joy of music was in creating it, not in applause or recognition. And the child listened, carrying their guidance as he continued on his journey. The piano itself became a symbol of the moment. That old, worn instrument, which had once been ignored and forgotten, had been transformed into a bridge between the child and the world. It had amplified not just the music, but the connection between hearts. People often spoke of it as if it were a companion to the child's talent, a silent partner in creating something unforgettable. The child's story began to inspire others as well. Young students who had once thought they weren't talented began to practice with renewed hope. People who had stopped in the square shared stories of how they had been moved, reminding others that sometimes the smallest gestures or quietest moments could have the greatest impact. It became a story not just about music, but about belief, perseverance, and the power of honesty in what you create. Time passed, but the memory of that first performance remained vivid for everyone involved. People would speak of it for years, often with a smile, sometimes with tears. And the child, now aware of the effect his music could have, continued to play, not for fame or reward, but for the joy of sharing something beautiful, something human, something that could touch the heart of anyone willing to listen. He began to understand that a single moment could change everything, not just for himself, but for others as well. One quiet afternoon in the middle of a busy city square, he had unknowingly reminded the world that extraordinary beauty could come from the most unexpected places. And he carried that lesson with him forever, in every note he played, in every melody he imagined, in every quiet, heartfelt performance that would follow. Even as the years went by, people who had been there still spoke of the child and the piano. They remembered how a simple melody had paused their busy lives, touched their hearts, and reminded them of the power of hope, beauty, and courage. And the child himself never forgot. Every time he sat at the piano, he remembered the eyes that had watched him, the hearts that had listened, and the moment when the world had begun to see him not as just a child, but as a creator of something timeless and extraordinary. It was more than just a performance. It was a turning point, a lesson, a gift. And it all began with a child, a piano, and a simple desire to share what lived inside him. From that day forward, he carried the understanding that even the smallest voice, the quietest hand, the youngest heart could make a difference if it dared to speak and to create. And so, the story ended not with a final note, but with a beginning. The beginning of a journey that would continue for a lifetime, touching hearts, inspiring souls, and reminding everyone that extraordinary beauty often comes from the most ordinary places if only someone is willing to listen.